Hope everyone is doing well. Today we are going to be doing our final lecture for the Civil Rights Unit and our final lecture of the year, actually. So far, we have been looking at what we might call the mainstream civil rights movement as it emerged in the 1950s and 1960s, led by figures such as Martin Luther King. Today we're going to be looking at sort of an alternative approach to civil rights, kind of a more radical branch of the civil rights movement that emerged alongside this more mainstream movement that we've been talking about so far. So what I wanted to start with is looking at what characteristics distinguished this alternative approach, which really, you know, most generally can be described as Black nationalism. And this was something that wasn't, entirely new. This split between Black nationalism and the more mainstream approach to the civil rights movement goes all the way back to the earlier part of the 20th century. Marcus Garvey was one of the kind of earliest voices for Black nationalism compared to, say, what the NAACP was doing under W.E.B. Du Bois and others like that. So when we compare these two, one of the things we can note is that Black nationalism, promoted basically self-determination for Black people in America. They were critical of the idea of integration, which of course was one of the big goals of the mainstream civil rights movement, because they were concerned that integration might ultimately mean the loss of Black identity. That basically integration might just mean that Blacks were, just losing their own cultural identity by integrating fully into what was sort of the white American cultural identity. So Black nationalism meant, maintaining, a separate culture for Blacks in America, or at least a distinct cultural identity. Now, in the most radical form of this, you did have some who promoted Black separatism. Um, Blacks actually living separately from whites. Within the United States, some promoted sort of something known as the Back to Africa movement, but for most separatists even, this would be maintaining separate Black communities within the U.S. Now, this might sound on the surface like it would just be promoting what the status quo was, a segregationist society. The difference, though, is that, in this envisioned scenario, Blacks would be empowered within their own community, right? They wouldn't be an inferior class within a segregationist racial hierarchy, but rather would have the political and economic power within their own communities. Even that, though, this sort of separatist idea was not favored by most Black nationalists. Black nationalism, in its most common form, didn't mean living separately from, the rest of the country, but rather maintaining a separate or distinct Black cultural identity. Secondly, Black nationalists were also critical, at least most were, of the tactic of and philosophy of nonviolence, which we've discussed was a pretty central feature of the mainstream civil rights movement as practiced by King and others. And so the critique was that this was, too weak of an approach to achieving rights, that it basically depended upon, gaining sympathy from whites, or depended upon, people becoming outraged enough by what was happening to nonviolent protesters to, you know, take action to help them. And so instead, many black nationalists promoted the idea of blacks arming themselves and therefore taking responsibility for protecting their own communities, um, you know, through armed self-defense, essentially. So it was a more of a militant type approach to civil rights, certainly compared to the mainstream civil rights movement. Um, Now, when we talk about black nationalism in terms of different organizations that emerged, we can start by looking at the Nation of Islam. This was a group that was founded, I think, in the 1930s, maybe 40s, pretty early on, um, and ultimately led through most of its early history by Elijah Muhammad. Now, this group, you know, as the name suggests, had this additional element of religion to it. Members of this group were Muslim, although the kind of theocracy, or rather, sorry, the theology of the Nation of Islam, what had significant differences from kind of, you know, mainstream Sunni Islam. Um, and you know, there were certain elements to their uh, religious beliefs that were kind of infused with black nationalist ideas, but went even further than that into outright black supremacy. So you know, to go back to black nationalism for a second, overall, you know, it entailed taking pride in you know, their racial identity, right? But it wasn't necessarily, in most cases, wasn't a sentiment that blacks were superior to other races. But within the Nation of Islam, you did have that additional element that often came through of actual supremacy of blacks. And again, this related back to the theology, actually, and this idea that blacks had been the original race, and that all other races were sort of like um, kind of corrupted versions of the original people. Now, again, the leader of this group was Elijah Muhammad, but the most famous figure to come out of the Nation of Islam for sure, as we see pictured here, was Malcolm X. So Malcolm X was, you know, born as Malcolm Little. He, you know, grew up in pretty tough circumstances, got involved in a life of crime from a pretty young age as a teenager, ended up in prison um, during the 1940s. And it was when he was in prison that he converted, uh, you know, to the beliefs of the Nation of Islam in 1948. Changed his name to Malcolm X, which represented the idea that his, you know, original family name going back generations was kind of lost to history when his ancestors were taken into slavery out of Africa. And so the X represented that unknown family name. Once he was out of prison, he really became, as I said, the leading figure, at least the leading sort of public spokesperson, minister for the NOI, the Nation of Islam. Um, Very charismatic speaker, you know, like Martin Luther King, who we discussed, had emerged as such a prominent figure, you know, largely based on his, you know, charisma, his prowess at speaking. Although certainly we looked also at King's strength in organization and um, tactics and things like that. But Malcolm X shared some of those characteristics, and certainly in terms of charisma, with King. But again, his philosophy was very different in terms of stressing militancy and nationalism. However, um, Malcolm X did undergo a pretty major shift in his views. Not a complete transformation by any means, but in 1964, he left the Nation of Islam and began to kind of follow his own independent course in terms of his kind of role in the civil rights movement. Um, a lot of this was kind of instigated by a trip he had taken to the Middle East. He went on the Hajj, which is the traditional um, Muslim pilgrimage to Mecca, and became kind of exposed, more directly to some more mainstream Islamic teachings and beliefs. Also, exposed to Muslims from all different parts of the world. Um, and so after this experience, he embraced more traditional Islam and took on a more global perspective on civil rights. Um, he started to stress, for example, or connect the struggle for African Americans to the struggles that uh, blacks faced, throughout the world, whether that be as minorities in countries, but also the struggles that entire societies or countries faced under the colonial rule of foreign countries, right? I mean, this is still 1960s is actually the decade, I think, when the most number of African countries actually finally gained independence from European colonial rule. And so, sort of, those struggles were happening simultaneous to what was going on domestically in the United States. Um, Another thing is Malcolm X actually renounced some of his earlier beliefs, specifically uh, the belief in black supremacy, which I mentioned was um, really part of the uh, Nation of Islam to a significant degree. And Malcolm X had earlier referred to whites as devils. And he began to talk in different ways and, again, no longer stress or really no longer pronounce this idea of black supremacy. But he still believed in black nationalism, still believed in a more militant approach to civil rights and in the need for blacks to arm themselves and protect their own communities. Um, since it was believed basically that the white power structure, that the police weren't actually going to protect blacks, or in some cases, even would be a threat to them. Ultimately, this new version of Malcolm X was pretty short-lived. Um, he was assassinated in 1965, the following year. Um, by it's never been definitively proven sort of who was behind the assassination, but it's pretty clear it's connected to the Nation of Islam. That operatives from that organization, which he had left the previous year, most likely under the orders of Elijah Muhammad, although again that's not been proven definitively, um, assassinated Malcolm X. Um, I think there was definitely some personal animosity between the two men. I mean, not only because Malcolm X had left the organization, but one of the reasons he had left is he had become disillusioned with Elijah Muhammad. Once Malcolm X started to learn some things that, you know, in terms of sort of corruption within the group, infidelity on Elijah Muhammad's part, um, and so he started to be openly critical, after he had left. And ultimately, as I said, he was killed by the group. So that's 1965. What's interesting here is that is before black nationalism really gained its highest point of influence within the civil rights movement. So Malcolm X remains the figure who's most commonly associated with this kind of branch of the movement, but his biggest influence arguably came after his death. That is to say, when we see the emergence of the Black Power movement in the late 60s, uh, Malcolm X remains, even after his death, a major figure sort of inspiring or having, being a basis for that emergence. And so that's what we'll be looking at on the next slide here. Black Power became kind of the slogan and the name for this movement starting in the late 60s and moving into the 1970s that embraced uh, this, again, more aggressive, kind of more radical approach to civil rights. Um, and so even some of the groups, like SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, who had been part of the mainstream civil rights movement, in the early 60s, and in the case of CORE, even prior to that, and who had believed in um, nonviolent direct action as the main tactic, for example, of the movement, um, they began to shift and they began to embrace um, Black nationalism, Malcolm X's more radical approach, which we were discussing on the previous slide. Um, Now, in the case of SNCC, this became somewhat ironic because, of course, their very name had nonviolent in it, and at a certain point, uh, they started, I think, referring themselves instead as the Student National Coordinating Committee to kind of reflect this shift to a more militant approach. Um, Now, not all groups shifted in this way. Notably, uh, SCLC, which was Martin Luther King's group, um, they continued to work and with their more traditional philosophy, continued to stress, nonviolent direct action as the tactic that they both believed in philosophically and felt was going to be most effective at actually achieving results. And so we discussed in the last lecture that as we move into the late 60s, SCLC, um, you know, if you remember, this is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, actually moves out of the South, goes to the North, engages in a campaign in Chicago, for example, to fight against housing discrimination. But they maintain sort of the same basic philosophy and tactics that they had used in the South. But some of these other groups definitely do begin to shift. SNCC um, undergoes a leadership change that reflects this. John Lewis, for example, who had been the previous chairman of the organization, disagreed with this shift in the group and left the organization. And Stokely Carmichael comes in as the new leader and becomes strongly associated with this emphasis on Black nationalism. And in fact, it's Carmichael who's actually the first to use this phrase "Black Power," um, and as the name suggests, this was seen as empowering blacks to take sort of ownership and responsibility for, liberating themselves from the racist society that they lived in, and felt that the traditional approach had relied too much on, as I kind of mentioned before, gaining the sympathy of whites. And a lot of the activists, despite a lot of progress that had been made, and we mentioned Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, some felt that the progress wasn't being achieved fast enough or more thoroughly enough, and that therefore a more aggressive approach, um, a more sort of as I've mentioned, militant type approach, if you will, was needed. So the Black Power movement also becomes associated with some other features. Um, Even the rhetoric, the language that's used, is much more revolutionary than the mainstream civil rights movement. Um, and so, for example, if we look at King's approach, and I don't want to go too far with this. I mean, in terms of drawing this distinction, because even the mainstream civil rights movement was viewed at the time as being very radical. We don't really look at it that way anymore, and we have a Martin Luther King Day as a holiday in this country. But at the time, I mean, he was under surveillance by the FBI. He was viewed by many as sort of a danger to the country, even though they were, utilizing these nonviolent tactics. Um, he was, arguably promoting in his later years, kind of socialist type of ideas economically. But it was always a movement, um, that is the mainstream movement, always favored the idea of reforming American society, that America could change and had always, you know, changed through its history, and that the civil rights movement was pushing for this next step in the evolution of America. The Black Power movement, on the other hand, used rhetoric that was much more revolutionary, that there needed to be sort of a wholesale transformation of America in a much more dramatic way and not just sort of reforming things. And maybe this is somewhat semantic or linguistic, but you definitely kind of see more of an influence here from kind of Marxism, revolutionary socialism, as opposed to, say, democratic socialism or sort of reform type movements. Um, Symbolism. The raised fist salute becomes a kind of symbol of Black Power. This photo here is from the 1968 Olympics, where you have two black athletes here from the United States on um, the podium, having won medals, giving this gesture as kind of a political statement during the ceremony. They were stripped of their medals, actually. The Olympics has a ban on any kind of political statements at the Olympics. And they knew that, and probably knew that would happen, but felt they still wanted to kind of make that statement, even knowing what the consequences would be. Um, I think I mentioned before the idea of having pride in blackness, sort of pride in black culture, as a part of black nationalism. Certainly was a big part of the Black Power movement. Um, so whether this be music, art, literature, food, clothing, um, sort of embracing and stressing, if you will, the beauty of black culture and art became a prominent thing. Um, it's around this time also that you start to see the emergence of Black Studies programs at colleges, emphasis on Black history, and trying to integrate that in not just at the university level, but filtering down into secondary schools and high schools, things like that. Um, Even getting down to physical appearance. You had the slogan "Black is beautiful," um, to try to fight against you know notions that had become kind of ingrained in society, that white features were more attractive than black features, and the feeling that even blacks themselves had started to sort of buy into that idea, or sort of been that idea had been sort of ingrained so thoroughly in society, that had led to a sense of inferiority at, even at this basic physical sense, over generations. Um, and so, for example, embracing natural hairstyles, the afro becomes much more kind of common and popular in the late 60s and into the 1970s. So, in terms of the effects of this, obviously, one thing that's happening here is, um, elements of, um, well, we mentioned the differences, right, between black nationalism and the more mainstream civil rights movement. So there are differences kind of in philosophy and tactics. But there's also, black power is kind of opening up the emphasis of the movement. So it's not just about gaining political rights or equality, but also stressing these additional kind of cultural elements. I think that was important. One of the downsides, though, um, is as this movement, especially when it came to kind of the more militant, revolutionary type language that was used, began to alienate uh, more moderate whites who had supported, and this had been one of the big breakthroughs for the civil rights movement in the early to mid 60s, and had really been consciously part of Martin Luther King and others' strategy was, you know, have these big campaigns in places like Birmingham and Selma that would bring the attention of the nation to the issue, in the hopes that they could kind of like rattle the conscience of the nation, awaken, um, you know, moderate whites um, to the issues so that they would embrace them and ultimately get enough support to pressure, you know, the government basically to take action. And we again see victories with the 1964 Civil Rights Act and 1965 Voting Rights Act most prominently, but also the 68 Fair Housing Act, which I briefly mentioned in the last lecture. But once we do see the emergence of the Black Power movement, some began to become, I don't know, frightened maybe by this, or feeling things were going too far, um, and so that kind of has a backlash element to it that is probably ultimately detrimental to the overall civil rights movement, at least arguably detrimental to it. All right. The group that perhaps captures best all of these different elements of what we've been talking about, and becomes certainly the most famous and arguably infamous Black Power organization, was the Black Panther Party. Um, so the Black Panthers were founded in 1966 by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale in Oakland, California. So they're pictured here on this slide. You can see from just the visuals here why many whites maybe started to get a little intimidated or frightened by what was going on. You've got the sort of militant outfits here, the berets, open carrying weapons. But this group also became, symbolic of this idea again of Black empowerment during this period. Started in Oakland, as I said, but grew to open up, branches, if you will, in dozens of cities across the country, with several thousand members. Although several thousand even is not a huge organization. I mean, I think definitely their influence and their prominence in kind of the public eye maybe outstripped their overall size. But certainly they, as I said, became very well known. Initially, so there were a number of different kind of activities, if you will, or uh, things that the Black Panthers focused on. The first thing, and again, this started in black neighborhoods in Oakland, is focusing on the issue of police brutality. And the Black Panthers would actually basically go on armed patrols of black neighborhoods to expose police brutality, confront the police if they felt that they were, um, you know, acting in a harassing way uh, towards black people in those neighborhoods. Essentially, they, and this kind of goes back to what I mentioned, and I think our first slide for this lecture is this idea of blacks taking responsibility for the protection of their own neighborhoods when they felt that the police were not doing that, and maybe even were a threat to those neighborhoods in some cases. But as you might imagine, in cases where they would confront the police, this sometimes led to violent confrontations, especially since again they were open carrying weapons when they would do this. Um, so that was one of the first things that they were involved in. But there was kind of what we might call a softer side to the Black Panther Party. And this was, again, in line with this idea of taking responsibility, not just for the protection of black neighborhoods, but for the overall well-being of those neighborhoods. So they did start offering community social programs, running health clinics. Um, One of the more famous types of programs was a free breakfast for children program that they ran in the morning before school. Um, and again, this started in Oakland, but you had these types of things that started to pop up in a lot of these other cities as well. And so at these programs, as the name suggests, they'd be providing breakfast to kids, although they also would take the opportunity to sort of be educating them about, Black history and Black culture, and stressing, taking pride in their Black identity. So it's, partially, not just providing a service, but trying to promote this kind of philosophy of Black nationalism. Um, on the other hand, you also see that the Black Panthers were not just viewed as controversial because they were an armed group and were seen as potentially threatening just based on that, but they did begin to get involved in criminal activities as well, especially as we move into the later years. Um, Maybe partially out of a need to fund the organization, but then it sort of gained a momentum of its own as well. You see members engaging in robbery, drug dealing, extortion, and other types of crimes, to gain money that was ultimately directed towards their other activities. Although also, I'm sure, enriching individual members in many cases as well. Um, Ultimately, the Black Panther Party, probably reached its peak influence, around 1970 or so. But by the time we move into the mid 70s, the group definitely began to decline. Um, there was infighting between different leaders of the group, some of whom wanted to really just focus on um, political issues, and um, focusing on issues of gaining equal rights for blacks and helping black communities, where others began to uh, focus more on these criminal type activities. Um, you definitely start to see declining popular support for the group. Again, they had always been controversial, but um, again, when the criminal stuff becomes more well known, that certainly causes them to take a hit in terms of popular support, and also action by the FBI, of course, as you might expect law enforcement to get involved. Although this went beyond, just arresting people for crimes. I mean, this was the FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover at this point, um, and they also engaged in some tactics that were definitely shady at times, and some Black Panther Party members, at least one, Fred Hampton, was assassinated while sleeping in his bed during a police raid. Um, but you know, overall, I think we can say that the Black Panther Party um, had a period of a lot of influence, certainly a lot of notoriety, but their decline happened pretty rapidly as well. So this is our last slide, but I did want to take a moment and kind of give an overview, not really an overview of what we talked about so far, but kind of look at the big picture here and the overall influence of the civil rights movement as a whole. And so certainly um, this period that we've covered from the mid 50s, starting with um, the Montgomery bus boycott and the Brown v. Board of Education case, all the way through, let's say, the mid 70s, was a period of dramatic change. Um, Large scale activism, mostly through nonviolent direct action, but then also, as we've seen today, this emergence of this kind of alternative, more militant approach. But dramatic grassroots movements that do produce, especially at least in the first decade, major results, both at kind of the local level in some cases, and then ultimately through some big national legislation. Um, the other thing, though, and this is specifically related to issues of of race, and that is to say, issues facing African Americans in the United States, ending the Jim Crow segregation laws, removing the barriers to voting that blacks had faced, things of that sort. What we also see, though, in terms of influence, is that this becomes kind of a model for other social movements that emerge during the same period, or maybe slightly after, towards the tail end of the civil rights movement, as other marginalized groups in the country began to organize and push for changes and more equal rights as well. And so the Black Civil Rights Movement has a big influence on the emergence of um, second wave feminism, the women's rights movement. Um, first wave feminism refers back to the suffrage movement in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Second wave refers to the women's rights movement that really gets going, again in the 60s and into the 70s, stressing issues like employment opportunities, um, issues of um, reproductive rights, issues of sexual harassment and assault, and pushing for changes in the society to address those types of issues. We also see the influence, though, in movements of other ethnic groups, the Hispanic American rights movement, the Native American rights movement. You could look at the gay rights movement also. And so in each of these types of social movements, again, you see the influence of the philosophy of grassroots organizing and the tactics of nonviolent direct action. But in each of these movements, you often would see as well the emergence of a sort of more radicalized, um, type of branch of those movements as well. Um, and so um, it's sometimes referred to this period in U.S. history as kind of the rights revolution, as you see the emergence of social movements as well as, and this is true in these other movements as well, definitely, court decisions or legislation that actually does begin uh, to make changes in both the kind of political and social realm of the country. Okay, so we will leave it there. Um, be on the lookout on Edsby for information about our last test, which will be a paper one style DBQ essay. So there'll be sources that you'll look at, and then you will write an essay in response to a prompt where you'll both use the sources as well as outside knowledge, which basically the idea would be that would be knowledge, coming from these lectures that I've done for a civil rights unit, as well as perhaps some of the readings that you've done for the written assignments. And so I will be posting that for next rotation. All right, guys, stay safe.